The media spin machine, both on the left, the right, and the Russian media, are already spinning Trump's phone call with Putin. Just what was actually discussed, what did they agree to, and why is each side saying something very different about what happened? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, so for this is one of those stories, I actually reached out to Ground News and was like, guys, I need you guys to sponsor this video because, well, it's fairly obvious that Putin and Trump had a major phone call just a few hours ago, really. And what's been insane has been the fallout from this, particularly in the different media outlets. Now, the overall headline that we're seeing is some version of this, right? And Putin agrees to halt strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure for 30 days after call with Trump, which you notice it's not actually using some of the keywords like ceasefire. Now, but when you see how it's being covered by different sides, you see it's a little bit insane. And before we get really deep into it, I wanted to mention a few things. First off, Ground News is the sponsor of this video. The fundamental appeal of Ground News is that it's really more essential in this day than ever. And if you can go to my link in the description, you can get 40% off their Vantage plan, but it is a huge help for exactly like these kind of stories, right? Because you can see that's being covered by a host of different sites, different news sources, ranging from the far right to far left sources and tons in the center. And it lets you filter out to see exactly how they're covering it. Now, look at how center sources are covering this story. We can scroll through and see a pretty well-known centrist outlet. Let's see if we can find it. Like Sky News, right? Where it says Putin agrees to a partial ceasefire in Ukraine after Trump call, right? Saying that they said Putin stopped short of backing a 30-day ceasefire and said any long-term deal would require a halt to intelligence sharing and military aid to Ukraine, right? And this is a center news outlet, high in factuality, owned by an independent family. So we can actually, I think this is actually a pretty good summary of what happened, right? It includes both the positive steps like Putin's partial ceasefire agreement and, of course, the more jarring negative stories, which is primarily that Putin said in this call that any ceasefire would have to entail ceasefire, not peace deal, ceasefire would entail a termination of military aid to Ukraine and an end to intelligence sharing. Now, you may think, as we've talked about, may ask yourself, if Putin was serious and thought the ceasefire would lead to a sustained peace deal, why would it be really important that Ukraine not receive military aid or intelligence assistance, right? Put on your thinking caps. Do you think that's the action of someone who is sincere about the ceasefire remaining persistent? Now, let's look at how the left of center sources are covering this, right? Particularly, we'll scroll down. We'll find a fairly well-known left of center website. Oh, let's see if we can actually find it here. Oh, let's see if we can find how Vox is covering it, right? Saying Trump's call with Putin briefly explained. So what did and didn't just happen. And this is actually a really, well, they're sort of hiding everything. They're hiding the fact that there wasn't really all that much that was ultimately agreed to, right? Again, a 30-day pause in attacks on energy and infrastructure like power plants and refineries. But the real news story is, again, what wasn't agreed to, which Putin didn't agree to a full ceasefire, which Trump had proposed. And Ukraine said, I'm on board with it. A 30-day ceasefire sounds great, right? Russia, of course, said that he would only agree to such a thing if all foreign countries cut off military and intelligence aid to Ukraine. Well, one of the things, of course, that makes no sense for a variety of reasons, but also makes no sense because the only reason the war is at a stalemate is because of that military and foreign assistance to Ukraine. And so it would simply grant Putin the conditions for a victory. And so he asked for literally a total victory condition and ended up, of course, getting denied for it, right? But you can see what I find most interesting actually about a lot of this is when you look at the right of center sources, you look at how incredibly generous this source is to Trump in the agreement, right? They agree on a 90-minute call on movement to peace, beginning with energy and infrastructure ceasefire, right? This really just washes away the insane ask that Putin made to basically said, I won't have any kind of ceasefire. I won't be terminating my military operations for any reason as long as Ukraine receives any foreign aid and assistance and intelligence sharing. This is not the road to peace. This is not someone who's interested in peace, right? And the thing is, the fact that so much of the right of center media is sort of carrying water for this. I mean, look at this one, The Messenger. They literally included this random afterthought. Trump and Putin discuss a U.S. hockey series during their call, right? This is the least important part of this entire thing. This was probably like what's the word I want? A small talk before an important meeting, right? Just like every time I ever met with any kind of high-level authority figure, they always did some kind of glad handing. And they're like, oh, how do you like it out here in El Paso? Pretty hot one today. And it's like, dude, we're here to investigate your agents like beating the shit out of detainees or something. You don't need to have a cheerful conversation about the weather. So the fact that even someone like Breitbart, literally their headline is Putin says Trump agrees to a hockey game between the U.S. and Russia. This is like absolutely insane. And insane, like burying the lead on this pretty significant story, right? Now, one of the feature of Ground News that I do want to talk about that I think is really important is actually their blind spot. Let's see if we can find it here. The blind spot analysis is actually really good. Let's see if we can find it. Particularly, there you go, the Ukraine war. This is one of my favorite ones because it is actually two stories that are only covered by one side of the media or the other, right? For example, only 10% of left of center sources reporting Steve Witkoff highlighting his Russian negotiations, but says Trump is the ultimate decision maker. And it's funny because I think this is a little weird because ultimately Trump is, well, that's obvious in how Trump is running the government, and that his actions and feelings and impulses are simply taken as edicts and they're just executed on. Right. And of course, no one on the right is saying, it was reporting that Zelensky has said, well, hey, guys, this is actually a pretty important story. Zelensky is like, well, I'm not so sure about Russia's ceasefire commitment because literally he just, as soon as he hung up the phone, Russian drones targeted our energy facilities and civilian areas, including a hospital. Right. And this is kind of insane. And a sign, again, that Putin is not a serious negotiator, right? There's some things that they think might be good, right? For example, again, here's another story that's being widely reported by both sides, but actually you can see more reported by center and right of center outlets, where they say, listen, there's a large mutual prisoner exchange that was agreed to. Russia exchanging 327 prisoners of war, including 175 Ukrainian POWs and 175 Russian troops. This is interesting for a couple of reasons, most notably that I think that this is a sign of genuine good faith, but Russia-Ukrainian prisoner exchanges have been going on the entire war. So I think this is a case of Putin taking something he was going to do anyway, right? And then framing this as some sort of good faith gesture. And right as it stands now, this is, as far as we can tell, the only good faith gesture that we can be confident Putin is doing and implementing. Again, the energy infrastructure attacks really pose some serious, really leave us with some serious issues. There's also a rumor, and this is actually, I think, another good illustration of Ground News' utility. Right, this is actually a story that I saw initially on Reddit, right, which is Vladimir Putin makes Donald Trump wait for over an hour, and netizens, which is funny because that's only a term I've ever seen used in Chinese state media, or Chinese media, call it a power move. It says Putin kept Trump waiting for over an hour for a phone call on the Ukraine war, ultimately refusing a requested ceasefire, right? But when you look at the sources that cover it, it's very sparsely covered. It's covered almost entirely by kind of obscure foreign news outlets. Right. And none of these guys are legit or have any kind of substantive readership that I know of. ThePoke.com, right? Allgemein Dagblatt, NDTV, Die Telegraph, right? These are Daily Boulder. None of these are like serious outlets. And so I always wonder, again, you can see they're all kind of, some are high factuality, some are mixed factuality, but the fact that it's not being widely covered and is being covered only by very small kind of obscure outlets with even unknown biases, and a high proportion of them are kind of mixed in their factuality. This tells me that probably we should treat this with a grain of salt, right? Now, what I thought was also an interesting story worth talking about, Trump had a follow-up call with Zelensky, and Trump was thrilled about it. He's like, listen, we had a great call. He said, we're very much on track, right? Of course, the fact is that the White House is like, guys, we're moving right along. And it's difficult to say, given that we clearly are not moving right along. And what I want to point out is there's a couple of incentives that that Putin has. For example, the energy infrastructure strikes. That is one of the most damaging and effective strategic offensive tools in Ukraine's arsenal. Its ability to reach out and damage Russia's ability to hit oil infrastructure, because we know that the Russian war machine is basically governed entirely by oil. And the fact is that without their ability to export oil, their war machine, their currency is going to do a lot worse. In contrast, right, the Ukrainians actually have pretty resilient energy infrastructure at this point. And while it's very expensive and costly to continually rebuild it or repair it, it is not of the same, it is not strategically significant in the way Russian oil is, right? Particularly given that Russia and keeping its people insulated from the war is really important. And damaging their economy is one of the best ways that strategic decisions can impact the pocketbook and daily life of the average Russian. So I think this actually ceasefire is overwhelmingly favors Russia. But again, Zelensky is agreeing to it because he wants to show the president, he wants to show Trump, listen, I really am a good faith guy here for peace. I've compromised on a bunch of things that I said I would not compromise on already. I'm the one who's given things up, and Putin remains firmly entrenched in a militant mindset. And so this, I think, is an absolute sign that Putin's interest in peace is minimal. Now, here's what I wanted to do at the end. Right. And this is, of course, the White House's official statement on the call. Let's take a look at it here. Join me. Right. They said the official readout, again, that was publicly released, is that over this 1 hour phone call, the presidents spoke about the need for peace and the ceasefire in the Ukraine war. Both leaders agreed the conflict needed to end with a lasting peace. A bunch of these are no shit things, right? Things that almost no human being will disagree with. They said they improved bilateral relations between U.S. and Russia are good. The blood and treasure that both Ukraine and Russia have been spending on this war would be better spent on the needs of their people. Conflict should never have started and should have ended long ago with sincere and good faith peace efforts. Leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with energy and infrastructure ceasefire and technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire, and then permanent peace. These negotiations will begin immediately in the Middle East. Right. Leaders spoke of the Middle East as a region of potential cooperation to prevent future conflicts, which is interesting because, again, we know that particularly in Syria, the U.S.-backed forces and the Russian-backed Assad government are very much at odds because Assad is a war criminal who used chemical weapons on his own population. That makes him a persona non grata to the U.S. and democracies who have human rights, and to someone like Russia, where human rights are more of a suggestion or something you only have if you're an oligarch, well, that's not seen as such a problem. So, but they still said, again, the Middle East is a region where we can try to sort of leverage our collective interests. But then they said it's good to stop the proliferation of strategic weapons and engage with others to ensure the broadest possible application. Two leaders shared the view that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. Very cool and important. And of course, deals between geopolitical stability and improved bilateral relationship with the U.S. That's the official U.S. readout, right? Now, notice here, this is the official Russian readout. Notice it's quite a bit longer. In fact, it's much, much longer. Let's just take it paragraph by paragraph. Look how different this account is, right? Of course, they both say we want to see a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Vladimir Putin said he was willing to work out possible solutions in cooperation with American partners, aiming at reaching a settlement that would be comprehensive, reliable, long-lasting, and naturally take into account the essential need to eliminate the root causes of the crisis, which, again, you might recall, is what Russia believes is a pervasive problem of Nazism and a pervasive discrimination against Russian speakers in Ukraine, as well as Russia's legitimate security interests. Guys, FYI, if you have to use the word legitimate to characterize your security interests, it's not legitimate. It's just like, imagine if I sat there and I promoted a legitimate investment. Guys, this is a completely legitimate investment, right? You would sit there and go, is this an illegitimate investment? And I go, no. Putin coin is a completely legitimate investment. So, that's what you should take for Russia's legitimate security interests, right? Again, every country has legitimate security interests. They don't usually need to couch it that way. But then they explicitly said that concerning the U.S. president's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire, the Russian side said basically a possible ceasefire included the need to stop the forced mobilization in Ukraine and rearming of the armed forces of Ukraine. And some serious risks pertain to the intractability of the Kiev regime, which had repeatedly sabotaged and violated negotiated agreements. This is a reference to Minsk II. Again, I want to point out that these agreements violated by Russia. This is just simply untrue, right? Or rather, they were violated by Russian-backed separatists who have no official association with the Russian government. Of course, guys. They're just armed, equipped, trained, financially backed by Russia, right? And of course, Putin wanted to let Trump know that there were barbaric acts of terrorism committed by the Ukrainian militants, right? Notice they're not the armed forces of Ukraine, which literally Russia acknowledges is doing the fighting here in the north, but then he calls them militants against civilians residing in the Kursk region. He says that, what I find fascinating is, again, there's just so much evidence of Russian war crimes. In fact, the targeting of civilian infrastructure is itself a war crime, right? Or rather, like things like hospitals, areas of no military value, right? Russia went after a children's hospital. This is not a legitimate target, right? A hospital treating wounded Ukrainian troops actually is a military target, but some of this stuff is absolutely absurd, right? And an obvious war crime that Russia perpetrates, in addition to the numerous killing of detained personnel. And again, recharacterizing them as militants allows Russian law to treat them as mercenaries or terrorists, not as captured combatants in a conflict, right? So again, the law of war, according to Putin, is whatever he wants it to be, right? Of course, they talked about the energy infrastructure proposal, and it says Vladimir Putin responded favorably to the proposal and immediately gave the relevant order to Russian troops. So it claims that Russia's own account says that he immediately ordered Russian troops to cease attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, which they violated literally within hours. So that should tell you either he has no control over his armed forces, which is possible, or that he was just blowing smoke up the president's ass, just lying through his fucking teeth, right? And of course, they said, we talked about the Black Sea, we talked about the POW exchange, and they talked about continued bilateral talks, which is interesting because, again, the talks aren't supposed to be bilateral, right? It's not America and Russia, it's Ukraine and Russia who are supposed to be the two sides in this conflict, as you may recall from the casualty numbers. And of course, they talked about the Middle East, bilateral ties, and then one more interesting one. Trump expressed support for Vladimir Putin's idea to hold ice hockey matches in both the United States and Russia between Russian and American players from the NHL and KHL. Now, I want to point out that last part is a little bit of a troll. Why? Because old Vladimir Putin, you might recall when another U.S. athlete went to play in Russia, she was detained on trumped-up charges and used as a political bargaining chip to extract the release of a convicted arms dealer held in American prison. And so the fact that the president would go to the NFL and say, NHL, and say, guys, Russia, those people that literally detained an American athlete just a few months ago, the president wants you to go play hockey in their place. And Putin knows that in Russia, if he wants someone detained or killed, they get detained or killed. That's it. No negotiations, no courts, no chit-chat. But if the president wants to detain somebody, believe it or not, we have this thing called the rule of law that says that the president can't just throw people he doesn't like in jail. They actually have to, get a warrant signed by a judge. They actually have to accuse them of a crime. They actually have to charge them with things. And so Putin knows that he will be able to he will be able to hold NHL players hostage, while his own players, of course, will not be held as political hostages because that's not how America works. So again, Trump just casually being like, yeah, send those players. Bro, you think any NHL player is going to sign up for that shit? Hell no. Hell no. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. A huge thank you again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Use my promo code. The link is in the description. Or you can go to ground.news/combatveteran to get 40% off your Vantage plan, or scan the QR code in the description. Really, these guys are invaluable for cutting through the BS around especially stories like this one, right? We obviously saw it. I literally needed them to get through the noise of this story, and you see how incredibly essential the work they do is. So again, thanks again to them. Check the link in the description. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.